Hey everybody, it's the Trout and welcome to another episode of the Trout Show. Thank you so much for stopping by. If you think about bands that play rock music or heavy metal, you probably think about people standing in front of a stack of Marshall amps, playing their strats as loud as they can, drummers, keyboard players, bassists, all that stuff. But you probably don't think about guys that stand in front of the band and play a violin. Well, today we have just the person that does that. His name is Joe Deninzon. He plays violin for the wonderfully talented band Kansas, which, by the way, is celebrating their 50th anniversary this year. Now, Joe talked about, to me, I had the privilege of talking to him, about how he became a member of Kansas, but why he even took up violin in the first place, because he came from Russia, and when he was in elementary school learning about American ways, he was playing violin. Can you imagine what that was like? I mean, do you think people made fun of him in grade school? Yeah, I bet. But he has a very talented family. His family's talented also. And so it's not unusual to hear a story about a guy that plays violin as good as he does with his career with Kansas. And he also has another complete band that he works with all the time. He's very much sought out as a person that helps in session playing for people all over the world. So the story he has to tell is very interesting, and I thought you'd like to hear about it. So if you want to hear about a guy that born in Russia and now playing violin in a rock band called Kansas, this is the story you want to hear. Because that story about Joe Deninzon with Kansas is next on The Trout Show. I'm going to start with something different probably, but did you start playing guitar before you played violin, or was it the other way around?
It was the other way around.
Okay.
Yeah, I started violin when I was 6 years old. My dad is a violinist, professional violinist, and it was kind of understood that I would be playing the instrument. It was kind of passed on, you know. And then when I got into rock and roll in high school, or like junior high school, I didn't even conceive that you could have a violin in rock music.
Oh yeah.
So I learned bass and I learned guitar. I started playing bass when I was 13, and I started guitar when I was 15. But I still kept up with the violin. So,
but I would assume though that everything you did was violin-wise was probably classical, wasn't it? When you first started out?
It really was. I didn't really have a lot of rock violin role models, and I wasn't aware of Kansas when I was a young kid.
Well, I spent a lot of time in Kansas City, so it's kind of like I kind of know who they were. I lived up there when they were becoming famous. But you had, and I assume your dad was he in a symphony, or what did he play? I mean, where did he play?
He played in the Cleveland Orchestra for 44 years.
Oh, wow.
One of the greatest orchestras in the world, and that's how we ended up in Cleveland, because he won the job there in 1979, and I grew up in Cleveland, and he just retired 2 years ago. But your last question, I was living two parallel lives. Growing up, I was doing my classical violin studies, and then I was playing in rock and roll bands and writing songs on guitar and bass and singing, you know. And at one point the worlds collided, you know.
Yeah. Well, that is, I would say the first famous one would probably be Jean-Luc Ponty. Would probably be around early 70s, I think. That's when he came out with Frank Zappa.
That's the first one I was aware of.
Yeah, I think he was the one. And that was the only one really heard about. You know, I grew up in that era before that. But I mean, I remember because of my best friend at the time was a huge Frank Zappa fan. So I kind of followed. Frank never did much for me, except when he had a couple albums that said "Shut up and play your guitar." Which was,
I'm a huge Zappa fan. Like one of my favorite artists.
I don't know. And this is off the subject. I met his son. Oh my gosh, it's been like 20 some years ago. And I was on the island of Lanai, which is people don't know anything about that, but I was there, and Lisa Loeb, they were dating at the time.
I remember, yeah.
She was on the plane with me, and you have to take a puddle jumper from Honolulu to Lanai. And there's only 2 resorts there. I was staying at one. And I said to my wife, hey, look, Lisa Loeb. She goes, who? I said, never mind, it doesn't matter. So I got off the plane and I said to her, hey, are you doing a gig here? What's the deal? I mean, it's not like there's thousands of people. She's a bunch of movie producers at hire. So we were coming back from breakfast one day, and there they were walking down the hall at the hotel, and it was like, it's Dweezil, you
Yeah.
know. And I never, it's funny. It wasn't until after I sent her an email about something. I didn't want to go like, hey, dude, I really loved your dad. I mean, it wasn't the kind of thing you do. I don't
I'm,
think, I can,
I'm sure he gets that all the
oh,
time.
I'm sure. And of course, he was already a great guitarist himself.
He's a
So,
ridiculously talented guy.
yeah, I
Yeah.
know. So
Um,
anyway, you started playing violin, and then, did you, as you went through the period of learning both, you were doing both, where you didn't spend more time writing rock songs and doing that instead of playing violin? I mean, how did that blend together? I mean, it
it
wasn't like
was
a lot of people were playing violin at the time.
it was a long and winding road. I mean, I was going to Cleveland Institute of Music for lessons. I was doing lessons with my dad. I was playing in Cleveland Youth Orchestra, but it always seemed like a very structured, rigid kind of, path to an orchestral career, which I didn't want. And when I
Yeah.
heard, and also being an immigrant, because we were from Russia, I didn't speak the language at first. And I felt like
Oh,
the
wow.
nerd in school. Violin wasn't cool, and people didn't understand what I was doing. And I just had this desperate need to connect. And I'm a performer. I love to perform.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I loved what appealed to me about rock and roll was that it was larger than life. You could be a
Oh,
Clark
yeah.
Kent Superman kind of
Yeah.
persona. And I didn't see that element in classical music, plus the freedom of creativity and expression. It just connected with me on a visceral level. So I started writing my own songs when I was 12, and I always dreamed of, forming a band and being a rock and roll star when I was a
Yeah.
kid. But I didn't see that on the violin till later. I had a few life-changing moments that kind of connected me with the violin as a rock instrument and a jazz instrument. Um,
Well, kind of now with what you do now, it really helps because obviously you play violin and you play guitar in the band.
Yeah, it's kind of my parents when they came to see the show, they said this is kind of the full circle culmination of everything you've loved growing up. You get to do everything,
Yeah.
and play music that you love, and play the instruments you love, and perform for people and have a great time.
And
And
the one
it,
thing about being in a symphony, which your father just proves, you get that gig and you stay with it. They don't go anywhere. I mean, it's like, can you imagine how hard it would be to become first violin in a symphony? Because that person's never, I mean, they're gonna be 85 years old before they finish up,
well,
you
my
know?
wife, my wife is in the New York Philharmonic.
Oh,
She's a
wow.
classical violinist too, and she actually is also from Russia. So she grew up going to the same music school as my dad, and it's a very competitive field. You're competing against hundreds of people for every audition,
Oh, yeah, I'm
and
sure.
and you don't get to be creative, and you're kind of at the whim of the conductor. And if you want to get that first chair position, that's even more cutthroat. It's a very tough world. And I didn't want to play that game. I wanted to do my own
Yeah.
thing, march to my old drummer, so to speak. You
Well,
know.
and you're going to play classical music. You might get lucky and play some John Williams stuff or, Hans Zimmer stuff if you're lucky if they do that. But most of the places they don't do that. They pretty well stay with the
I mean,
rigid kind of thing.
the New York Phil plays everything. They played with John Williams and Danny Elfman, but they've also played
Yeah, Danny.
Shostakovich. They played Shostakovich with um, Bitchkov and a lot of great conductors have they're some of the best conductors in the world, and that's a real
Mhm.
out of body experience playing a great symphony with a world class conductor.
Oh, I can imagine.
It's a total mind blowing thing in its own way, So I love playing in orchestras. It's just not something I would want to do all the time for the rest of my life. When I get to do it, it's fun, you know.
Yeah, and the
Um,
thing is, and I truly believe this, and most everybody I've talked to has been taught classically. They understand music better. I think they have an understanding of how it's all put together and all that stuff because of the classical music and learning all the stuff. I can read notes, but give me a week to give me a page, and it's like, hold on just a second. Let's see, that's an A. So
well,
I can't do sight reading right away.
if it's something you do all the time, if you're a violinist in a classical
Yeah,
symphony or chamber, that's all you do is read.
that's
But
all you do.
if a lot of non-classical musicians I work with can't read music, but in a lot of ways they're more creative and they process music differently.
Yeah,
And
I
what's
have a
interesting,
no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
no, what's interesting to me, I'm in the progressive rock genre,
We'll talk about that later. Yeah.
and it comes from classical music. It's that's a big source of progressive rock. Genesis and Yes, all those bands were influenced by the great classical composers. So
and Yes is one of my favorite bands.
Mine too.
I bought their first album, which was 1970, I think. Time and a Word. I bought it in L.A. Is it Time and a Word? I think that's what it was called.
Time and a Word. I think it was 68 or 69 when that came out. Yeah.
I was in Hollywood with my parents, and I used to buy albums based on the cover. I go, I don't know who these guys. Yeah, sounds pretty good. And then, oh my gosh. And then I started listening to them, and I'm trying to remember there's a couple of great songs on the album, and I thought, oh man, and then I just started following. Most of my friends at the time didn't care much for it. They didn't we didn't call it prog rock back then. It was just, oh, they're playing something different. And then they brought out the Fragile album, and they heard, all this stuff, and they're like, oh, I like this. And it's like, well, I knew about these guys beforehand. And I followed them and trying to figure out all the people. I mean, Chris Squire was one of my favorite bass players of all time. And to be able to, hold on a second. Okay. So I don't really, I mean, I guess you say Genesis, but there's a lot of prog rock people that came out at the same time after Yes, and a lot of people were doing it.
It was a whole era, yeah.
Yeah.
And then Kansas came out around that time too.
Yeah, because they were right after that, because they came out in 78, 71.
73, first album, yeah.
Yeah. So you were doing your own thing for a long time, and what's it like, though? This is the question I always wonder about, because so many of the bands now that I grew up with, the ones that are still performing, like Kansas, the guys are getting older, or they're not with us anymore, or they retire and they okay. But when you get the call for something like that, and you have to go, and I'm sure I had to audition, obviously, but that's kind of you're joining a club that's people already know. I mean, it's a thing, it's a standard thing. You're not making it, I mean, it's all there. You got everything, all the hits and all that stuff. Does that influence you? I mean, is that something that you go like, oh man, I really want to join this, or it's just something I want to do? But I guess my main question is, how does that feel to join a band that's so established? I mean, you're the new kid, you're the new kid on the block, so to speak.
In this case, it was a real surprisingly smooth transition for me. And my big concern, well, two things. I wanted to honor the legacy of Robbie Steingart and David Ragsdale and everything they contributed to the music. I have my own way of playing.
Sure.
I play a 7-string electric violin. I play with a lot of effects. Those guys played with a 5 or 4-string, more traditional sounds, and I was trying to honor that way of playing, but also, put a little bit of myself into the music. And also, I was nervous how the fans would react. How would they would they embrace me as the new guy, or would they, be like, oh, who is this dude? Yeah. So, but surprisingly, everybody was very welcoming. I would 99.9% of the people, the fans I've met and the reactions online were super positive, and I was very grateful for that. And I get along really well with the band. And it's great to play that music. It just suits me. It's my favorite kind of music to play. Mm-hmm. And if they decide to do a new record, it would be great to contribute to that legacy and, from a creative standpoint. But in addition to that, I still have Stratospheerius, which is my band that I've had for 20 years. We're putting out a new record in October.
Yeah,
I'm still writing.
We're going to talk. That's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about that, because when I heard it, I went, oh, this is a different band. I mean, obviously you guys have been together for a while because you're so tight when you play. But then when you...
Thanks.
And then when you listen to it, you go, okay, I can hear the influences. Then I found out you were in the Kansas band after Stratospheerius.
Oh, I mean, that's interesting.
Yeah, because when I heard it, I just looked at I listened to that first. And I said, okay, I want to talk to Joe about this. And it was later that I got, oh, I didn't know he played he was in Kansas too. It wasn't the other way around. It was.
You know,
Go ahead.
the funny thing was, I just felt the reason I started my own thing, I started Stratospheerius. I wanted to take all the music that I loved and put it into one project and create something new that was just a pure expression of my voice and my influences. And I as a sideman, I couldn't sit around and wait for that perfect project to come along. I had to create it from the ground up. And it just, even though it's a pain in the butt running your own band, it's very
Oh yeah, I know about that.
it's very satisfying when you make your own music and people connect with it and like it and come to your shows. Even if you're filling small venues, it's still the most amazing feeling. And I wasn't consciously setting out to audition for Kansas or any other band. I was just doing what I love. And Kansas happened to see one of the, Phil Ehart happened to see one of our videos, which is probably one of our more Kansas sounding songs. And that led to eventually to me joining the band. And that was kind of a happy accident and a result of many years of me just putting out music that I believed in, you know.
You know, it's interesting because I think a lot of times when you're not trying is when you get chosen.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's really true.
Now look at the guy that sings in Journey, you know, because he was making videos on YouTube when they found him. It's like, that guy sounds just like the other guy. And, you know, so here you, we were to talk to him. And same way with you, here they found you, which always makes it better than you finding them and say, hey, guess what? I can do this. But then it also, you're joining something that, you know, when you said it earlier, but whether people like you or not. But, you know, I think the thing about all the bands that are out there now, there's so many of them. And I look back and try to interview people that have been in bands. I'm going to be, in fact, I'm going to hopefully be talking to one of the founders of the Yardbirds. I mean, he's like 80 years old, but still, you know, but it's iconic. And a lot of people I know my age, they want to go see the bands like Kansas, or they want to see the Eagle, you know, whatever they like to see. And the sad thing for me is a lot of them are just not very many, you know, original members are left. Sometimes none.
I was talking to a friend of mine recently, and he really brought it home. He summed it up. He said, look, most of the guys in the iconic bands right now are in their late 70s, early 80s.
Yep.
In the next 5 years, definitely in the next 10 years, we're going to see a huge change. A lot of those people are not going to be able to play anymore, will retire or pass on or whatever. At that point, you know, people will have a choice. Do you want to go hear that music performed well live and you know, maybe not by the original people, but by people who believe in the music and try to honor it? Or do you want to stay home? Because that's the choice. And if you want that music to survive, you know, we're in that transitional period. I mean, look at jazz. There's still, the Duke Ellington band is still touring, you know?
Yeah, well, even the Glenn Miller, that's not jazz.
Glenn Miller, that's jazz, yeah. I mean, so rock is in that weird phase. I mean, there's a lot of great young bands too, but the level of cultural influence and the level of icon that, you know, the Beatles or the Who or the Stones or Yes, and all those bands, I don't think the younger bands have that platform anymore, but the music is still there.
They will.
You know?
I don't think they will. And I think the thing about it is you could think, well, okay, so baby boomers get older, they die off. But a lot of people, I'm sure you see at your shows with Kansas, a lot of people are younger that come to these things because they've heard the records or they don't listen to the streaming, you know, and they go, oh, I want to see them. So to them, it's not like we know who's in the members of the band. You know, if you grow with them, you go, oh, look, they got a new bass player. I know that guy's new. But when you're 20 years old and you didn't grow up with them, it's a band.
That's, you know, it's so true. Yeah,
and then
Kansas
you see them, and you know, and then all of a sudden it's like you just listen to the music. And here in North Texas, in Dallas, tribute bands, that's what everybody wants to hear. They want to hear a tribute band.
There's a difference between a tribute band and a legacy band.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Legacy band is when you have someone who played with the original members and they teach you how to really play, you know, the riff for Carry On Wayward Son, you know, versus a tribute band, which is a bunch of people that love the band that get together in their garage and figure out the songs. Yeah. Which, you know, I'm not, you know, nothing against tribute bands. They're great. No. But I think people confuse the two things, you know, sometimes.
I agree with you 100% because as a lead guitarist myself, I'd rather talk to Billy Gibbons and say, "Hey, Billy, how did you do this little lick here?" Instead of me going, "Okay, I think this is how I did it." If I come in
Sure.
and Billy goes, "Hey, here's how I did it," then it's like, "Oh, that's the way he did
You
it."
hear it from the source. Yeah,
Or
of
you go
course.
see him.
Yeah.
That's what I used to do. I'd go watch him, people like him, or watch a band and see, "How's he? Okay, oh, he's playing it there on the neck. I didn't know that."
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's the same way with tribute bands, and it's
Sure.
funny because people they just want to hear the music. And to me, I think it's interesting what your friend said because I think it's right. These people move on, then it's not going to be anybody left. It's going to be, well, it's kind of like the Allman Brothers. Now you got Allman
Yeah.
Sons in there. They're all, you know, it's the
Yeah.
people, the next generation come along,
Yep.
and then you
But
get,
the
I think,
music survives. The music
yeah, the music survives.
survives. And that's what matters. That's
And
what's
then you could
important.
then I think maybe because when you play Kansas stuff, they know what to expect. They know the songs, they know everything. But
Yeah.
then if you're a generation removed, so to speak, if you threw something in, they may not say anything because it's like, oh, this is his son doing it a little bit different,
They
or
don't have the point of reference. Yeah.
yeah,
What's interesting, I think when we see younger people in the audience, they come to it through shows like Supernatural, which used a lot of Kansas music, which had a
yeah,
younger audience,
yeah.
or their parents turned them onto it, or they might have heard it on TikTok. My kids discover a lot of music on TikTok. Like I'm like, how'd you know that song? I heard it on TikTok. So, despite my loathing of hit TikTok, there are some good things that come out of it. Certain people discover certain music.
Well,
That's cool, I guess. Yeah.
it is true though, but I think I was talking to some, I've interviewed dozens of musicians, but we were talking about the A&R people. And what they do
Mhm.
now is just go to TikTok,
Sure.
and just watch TikTok. And, oh, okay, because then it's like, well, we get them for big round, and then they're done. I don't think they're going to have stability like we do with a band like Kansas.
Yeah, it's as I like to say, they got tenure. Certain bands have tenure,
I
which
agree.
they can always tour off. They could have a few hit songs decades ago and tour off of them for the rest of their lives. And it's harder to get tenure now if you're a young band.
Oh yeah, well, it must be difficult for you because here you are in an iconic band, and you're doing your own thing. Because how do you fit that together? I mean, like you said, you got a new release coming out October 11th. And so, but you guys got to go out and support that too.
No, we're not really. Stratospheerius doesn't really tour. We'll do a handful of shows when I'm not
Over in
on
New
tour.
York area where you're at, live now, or in that area.
Yeah, that's the Northeast
Yeah.
regional mini tours. If I know that I have a week off, maybe I'll book something
Yeah.
farther out. But that's okay. We promote it online, people buy it, and the few shows we have we make it a big event because we tell people you're not going to get to see us that often, and that's okay. What the other thing is, like, I don't have the pressure. Before I joined Kansas, I felt like Stratospheerius was kind of make or break
Oh yeah.
kind of thing, and now I could
Yeah.
just do it for the love of it,
Yeah.
and whenever I can, and just relax and not worry about it so much, which
It's
is nice.
funny because I interviewed a backup singer for a very famous musician last week.
Mhm.
She's got her own music out, and she was so popular that she's doing it all the time. In other words, this is her main gig with this guy for 10 years, but then she goes does her own thing. But then other people want her to sing, so she's constantly busy.
Yeah.
So with you, you're constantly on tour, and then it's like, hey, call your buds up in Stradivarius, and hey, we're going to get together and do something. I mean, it keeps you busy.
Yeah, but also I do a lot of recordings for people. I do a lot of session work, and I can do that
Oh,
from the
okay.
road. So I get called all the time to play on people's records or on TV commercials, which is also a
Oh,
lot of
wow.
fun. And
Is it
if I'm
mostly, is it with the violin?
yeah, it's funny. I'm known mainly as a violin player, so I get hired to do, like, last week I did a rock project for an Indian band, and then I did a bluegrass project for another artist, and then I did a commercial for Citibank or something. And I have a home studio, but I have a little portable setup when I go
Oh,
on
so
the
when
road.
you're out on the road,
So
you can throw it down for them. They tell you what they
yeah,
like.
exactly, yeah, and that's fun and easy, and I love enhancing someone else's project and following their vision, and that's very rewarding in a different way.
And you get paid.
So that too, yeah, it's just like a side. It's a side hustle. So,
So,
and that's one of the many things I was doing before I joined the band, and it's still going. So
I think that you don't realize it, but until you start thinking about it, how much music's out there that people use all the time on TV. We just mentioned it right
Sure.
there. This person needs it, that person needs it, this person needs it,
All the
constantly
time.
evolving all the time. You go into a store and they're playing music, you're like, who is that? And you, it's, I,
But the music, the old days of recording studios, it's a different time now. Everyone has their own little recording setup on their
yep,
computer and works at home. In fact, the Stratospheerius album, everyone recorded in their home studios. We barely were in a room together when we
wow.
recorded any of those. We were just trading tracks, you know. Um,
I think
and
that's really, that's one of the things I like and I don't like about it. I mean, I love, because I record my own music too. And sometimes I wish I could get my friends together and go, hey, let's, but I'd have to go in a studio. I have to rent a studio to do that. And it's, you're still creating a product. And now it doesn't matter, like you say, India, Australia, they can send you what you want and then you can add it to it and you can do it on the fly. Well, I don't like this. Okay, change that. And
yeah,
boom, you're done.
I mean, there's nothing like being in a room together and kind of coming up with ideas on the spot and getting instant feedback. Of course, that's great, but if you don't always have that luxury, there's a lot of advantages to doing things remotely as well.
And then you're in a situation now that you're so well known that people contact you all the time. That's where you, that's a great place to be.
I could pick and choose. Yeah, it's wild.
Did you ever
So
think when you first started playing violin that you'd ever be in this situation? I mean, here's the question I ask everybody that's well known, or they join an iconic band. When was that moment when you're standing on stage with Kansas and you're going, holy crap, I'm playing with Kansas?
I think that moment happens every time I'm standing on stage
Oh,
with
really?
Kansas.
That's cool.
Yeah, I never stop appreciating it. And I tell
Oh,
myself
yeah.
if I ever get sick of this or if I ever get cynical, kick my ass because I mean, it's you think how many people how few people get to experience something
Oh,
like
yeah.
that. And how many people would love to experience something like that and how fortunate I am to be there. So
Even if it's one time.
even if it's one time.
Yeah,
So,
I told my wife all
yeah.
the time, I said, I know it sounds crazy. I'd love to play with American Idol band just once because they're so phenomenally great
Yeah.
musicians,
My,
you
my
know?
buddy my buddy Tony played with that band for a while. Tony
Wow.
Polizzi, great guitar player. Um,
And
so
it's like, and it's just like, you got the great singers. It's like, I don't care what I sound like. I just one time.
yeah,
Thank you
those
very
guys
much.
Yeah, those guys are like all the studio guys that sometimes are the ghost players on a lot of famous people's albums. They kind of get underappreciated. A lot of general public doesn't know about these musicians.
No.
I just read Steve Lukather's book, his memoirs, and you realize him and that rhythm section played on most of the records you heard in the late '70s and
Yeah.
through the early '90s. Like
When they
I
first
would say
started, Toad first
80%.
started, I thought, where did these people come from? Well, they were session musicians.
a- and he kept mentioning all these records. I'm like, wow, that was him, and that was him, and that was him. Oh my god!
I mean, when you think like,
Yeah,
wait a minute, he played with Michael Jackson? What are you talking? Wait a minute, I know that was him.
yeah,
You know, it's
it's
amazing.
wild.
And like you said though, I think the other part about it is when they're on a show like that, they don't get appreciated as much. I'd say probably from people like you and me, we know how good they are.
Yeah,
But they, they're
hmm
obviously working with the person out front, and then it's like, okay, these are the hired guns in the back, but they're the ones that are really making them sound good too.
they're doing all the heavy lifting, and a lot of the general public who are not musicians have no idea, maybe don't fully appreciate the
No.
amount of work that goes into that level of professionalism and just being on all the time.
And I have played with him for a
Um,
long time, a trumpet player that used to play. I think somewhat tired now, but he was always playing back in the day with Engelbert Humperdinck and people like that. Phenomenal. I played with him a few times.
cool.
And I asked him one time about playing because they'd always, he was a great sight reader. And I'd say, if I say we're going to do a blues riff and B, you know what to do. What do you do with people in the band? He goes, if it's not written down, they can't play it. You were talking about, they're just not creative because they don't know how to do it. And I think that's the part where you have and I have where you can be creative at the same time, but still you have the ability, hey, here's some music, look at it, you know. And that's, I think that makes a big difference too, because if they write out all this stuff for you, I'm not saying they did with Kansas, but they did, you can, oh, okay, that's how they did that.
Well, it was funny. It was just a matter of survival for me because I had to be able to read really well and play in orchestras and, go into a session and sight read. But I also played a lot of jazz gigs, rock sessions where you don't get any music written. You have to make your own chart or play by ear. Jazz, folk gigs, everything I could to pay
Well,
rent, and you just develop a wide set of skills. And when I got called for the Kansas gig, nothing was written down. I had to learn all the music by ear and transcribe it and memorize it that way. And I was not really surprised by that. I've worked with a lot of bands that work that way, that do everything by ear, and that's just how it is. And a lot of string players who come through traditional conservatories don't really know how to do that or expect to be spoon-fed everything. And it's not, it'll limit your opportunities if you only are thinking that way, I think,
I also think that they're missing out a lot. Because if
I
you've
think
never
so
really,
too.
if you're being told what to do, and I'm not trying to diss them or anything. I mean, I appreciate people that could play in the Philharmonic. I really do. When I
Oh,
was a
it's
kid,
amazing.
I went to see a Philharmonic, and I said, "Oh, I don't care. I just love the sound of all that stuff going on." But then it's like, what about the creative part? And I know to them, it's like, well, this time on this Beethoven song, we're going to do a little something like that. You know, it's still
Right.
creative, but not like,
There's a creative element, but
yeah.
it's within the context of a very strong tradition and very conservative approach to making music in a lot of cases. So to me, like my personality type, I find that to be stifling if I was
Yeah.
having to function in that environment all the time. So,
Well, and it's funny because Eric Clapton, as Glenn Johns one time said, he never plays the same lead twice. He
yeah,
sounds like Eric Clapton, but to get him to do, hey, do that again. No, do this.
right, right, of course.
And
And that's awesome. That's beautiful. You don't want to do it the same way twice.
well, in the last band I was in, we broke up during COVID. They
Uh,
wanted to do a tribute band, and I said, the problem with tribute bands, you got to play the notes exactly the way they're played. And I said, I like to go off, and people don't want you to go off if you're playing a song like
but,
whatever.
unless you do something like Hayseed Dixie and do a bluegrass version of AC/DC and and set it up like this is how I'm doing it and reimagining it, and people kind of expect that from you when they show up. Um,
So where do you go from here? I mean, you're going to tour for quite some time, aren't you?
yeah, we're about to start. We're doing the classics set for 2 more shows, which is a 90-minute set with all the hits and the shorter songs. Then Monday we go back to Tuesday to the 50th anniversary set, which is
Oh, that's
over
cool.
over 2 hours long, more deep cuts, and we do the third leg of the 50th anniversary tour, which takes us into mid-December. And then we're off for a month, and then we do more touring next year. We're adding dates next year. I don't know what we're going to do, but as for my band's, our new album, Stratospheerius, Impostor, comes out on October 11th, and you could pre-order it at 7dmedia.com, and that's the number 7 and the letter D,
Okay. And that's the
media.com.
new label or somebody I just saw where you signed with somebody new or what? Who's doing?
That's a new label. It's owned by Trey Gunn from King Crimson,
Oh,
and we signed with
wow.
them. And this is our first album we're releasing with their label.
Well, I,
And
I wish I had the luck for you. I love the music. I mean,
thank you.
Kansas is one thing, but your own gig is a different thing completely. Because I tell
Thanks.
this people all the time, you know this. Nothing better than playing a song you wrote, performing it, and people liking it.
It's the greatest feeling in the world. It's
Yeah.
like it's like Christmas every day.
Don't you wish you could kind of tell people how that feels? But
The- Those who know, they know. You know?